What are you doing? What are you doing? Get out of that room! Get out of that room! He's behind you! He's behind you! Oh no! Oh no! Run! Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! Okay. She's safe. Ah! Oh. Why do horror films scare us? Why do they impact us, and how do they scare us? What does the horror genre communicate? So what is the horror film genre? Well, the genre is a way for viewers to classify the tropes of a particular style. Action film, explosions. Romance film, kissing. But what is a horror film? Well, the horror genre, is it like scary? But it's not just scary, is it? What is it? What classifies a film as being part of the horror genre?
The first horror film ever made is considered to be The Haunted Castle from 1896. Except looking at it today, you don't really consider this to be a horror film. The horror genre is known for going through cycles and changes with the times.
The thing that is consistent among all horror films, and is what defines them, is their use of the emotions fear and disgust. A horror film can use these provocative emotions to communicate something to the audience. These films often represent the anxieties and fears of the time in which they were made, and also carry with them human, universal psychological fears as well. To illustrate this, I am going to pick 3 films: 1931's Frankenstein, 1980's The Shining, and 2017's Get Out. These 3 films are from 3 very different points in American history, and are about 3 very different things, but they are very similar in how they reflect the fears of the time, connected to a human psychological fear, and communicated a moral to the audience. They also are 3 films that are well crafted and have made a mark on American pop culture. Let's get started with dissecting Frankenstein. 1931's Frankenstein was a Hollywood adaptation of a novel by the same name, written by Mary Shelley. But since we're looking at horror films, let's ignore the book and examine the movie, shall we?
The movie was famous for its makeup and effects on the monster, played by Boris Karloff. The iconic pop culture look of green came from the fact that they used green makeup to give him a pale-looking colored skin. A brief summary of the plot would be what you may already know about Frankenstein, except Frankenstein isn't the name of the monster. It's the name of the doctor. Dr. Henry Frankenstein and his servant Fritz work in a secret laboratory with Henry's research, which involves digging up bodies for parts and stealing a brain. They create the iconic monster, and the very famous line, which was actually cut from the original 1931 release because of how controversial it was.
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
To make a whole movie short, the monster is set loose and does some damage. In the end, he is burned in the windmill, and Dr. Frankenstein lives maybe happily ever after. Hopefully he learned his lesson.
What is the lesson of this story? What is the monster? Is he truly a villain? Or is the mad scientist who created the monster the actual villain of this story? I think the thesis of this movie is summarized in that one famous line.
In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God.
Not only is he so arrogant, but, well, I'll just let Dr. Malcolm say it.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
Frankenstein is so occupied with pursuing the creation of life that he doesn't consider the consequences or aftermath of actually succeeding in his task.
Once the monster is alive, all he wants to do is gloat in his glory, and when the monster suddenly kills Fritz, then all Frankenstein wants to do is ignore the problem. He's about to get married before even knowing what's happened to the person who he put in charge of killing the monster. Ultimately, the tragic flaw of Frankenstein is his pride, which nearly costs his bride's life, and his own. But it does cost the lives of Fritz, his mentor, and the little girl.
On an even deeper level, looking at this movie, Frankenstein, the monster can represent metaphysical monsters we create, things that we do which unintentionally harm others. Because of his pride, Frankenstein created something which killed innocents. Underneath this horror film is a story of humanity's fear of the monsters we create, physical or metaphysical, and what happens when we don't have humility. The scariest thing can be when we become the monsters through our blind actions. Now, let's talk about a man going insane in a haunted hotel. Come play with us, Danny. Come play with us. Forever and ever and ever. This classic horror film is often considered the best horror film ever made, and like Frankenstein, it is also based off of a book, but we're gonna ignore the book, especially since Stephen King hates this movie. But it's so wonderful, how could you hate it? Oh. Anyway, what's kind of funny is upon its release, critics did not care for The Shining, and in fact, The Shining was nominated for some Razzie Awards, Worst Director for Stanley Kubrick, and Worst Actress for Shelley Duvall. I mean, poor Shelley, give the girl a break.
To summarize the plot of The Shining, it's about Jack Torrance, his wife Wendy, and their son Danny, who are caretakers of the Overlook Hotel, isolated during the winter in the mountains and snow. The hotel, however, is haunted, as you would guess, and Jack goes insane. Danny is special. Crazy stuff happens. Jack nearly kills them, but freezes to death in the cold while Wendy and Danny escape. Though this sounds straightforward enough, there are tons of interpretations on the internet, and even a whole documentary on Netflix dedicated to what people think The Shining is actually about.
Here's Johnny.
Here's my interpretation. If you look at this movie as the story of an alcoholic father with a past of abusing his son, slowly turning insane in a haunted hotel, the movie is about the demons that we have within us and what happens when the wrongs of our past come back to haunt us. This is communicated through the setting and the characters of the film.
The Shining is set in the Overlook Hotel, which is built upon an Indian burial ground and uses a lot of Native American imagery, driving home the nail that there is bloodshed and wrongdoing in the history of this place. In the hotel, there is also a past history of a man killing his family, and those ghosts come to haunt Danny, and other odd imagery follows the characters at the hotel. Jack, unable to defeat his demons, like alcoholism, succumbs to madness, and the past of abuse comes back to haunt the Torrance family.
There's also the psychological fear that connects with us regarding the family relationships. I mean, I think we can all agree that if your father or husband or other loved one was chasing you in a hotel trying to murder you, that's pretty terrifying.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Thankfully for Wendy and Danny, they were able to get out of the Overlook Hotel, which brings me to our next movie. Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out! Get Out, unlike the other two films I've been discussing today, were not based on books. This is actually an original screenplay written by Jordan Peele, who is actually known prior to this for his comedic sketches. Now, Get Out was a revolution at its release. According to IMDb, it has a cumulative worldwide gross of $255 million. That's a lot of money for a horror film, especially one with a relatively low budget. It was nominated for several Academy Awards and took home an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. Good job, Jordan Peele. What makes this movie stand out? Get it? Stand out? Like, get out? Anyway.
The movie is like a mix of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and an episode of The Twilight Zone, with a full cup of social commentary and a heaping spoonful of suspense, making for a unique psychological thriller. The protagonist, a black man named Chris, is going to meet his white girlfriend's family for a weekend in the country when things start getting really weird. The girlfriend's family kidnaps black people and puts rich white people into their bodies.
Now, there are tons of videos and articles out there breaking down Get Out, how it masterfully uses social commentary in the story, but I'm going to focus primarily on the horror elements and how that communicates its message to the audience, which is about racism.
Suspense, an unsettling atmosphere, creepiness, all these things build on top of each other as the film puts us into an uncomfortable position. It all comes together once Chris realizes that Logan is actually someone named Andre, and that Rose has a history of having black boyfriends. This, combined with the overall creepiness and Logan's screaming,
Get out! Yo! Yo, chill, man. Get out! Chill, man. Chill!
Chris decides it's time to get out. The third act is where the film turns into a real thriller as Chris manages to escape, defeating the dad, the mother, the brother, and the grandmother inside a black woman's body. Just as he is defeating Rose, the girlfriend who has used him like she has used so many other men like him, we see red and blue lights.
This is the point of true horror in the film, because we as the audience know what this picture looks like.
It's a black man standing over a bloody white woman's body. You know what this looks like, and you know what the cops are going to do. And so this is the moment where the audience realizes what this movie is trying to communicate.
That is how masterfully horror and fear is used to communicate that message to its audience. Thankfully for Chris, it was his best friend in a TSA vehicle there to save the day.
I mean, I told you not to go in that house.
The moral or message that Get Out is trying to communicate to the audience is very direct and explicit, being literally about racism. But because of Jordan Peele's excellent writing and direction, he is able to create a story that deeply resonates with us, a story filled with horror that feels almost too real.
These movies communicate the fears of the time and also timeless fears that we as people will always have. And sometimes these movies act as cautionary tales or warnings of the consequences when we aren't humble, don't recognize our demons or our past, or are oblivious to the true horror all around us.
The thing that makes the horror genre stand out and so unique is because it uses the human emotions we like the least, fear and disgust. And when a horror film can use fear and disgust in effective ways, it can truly scare us. But we should be scared of things like pride, ignorance, and prejudice. The horror genre uniquely communicates, using our universal human emotions and fear, and reflects our society's fears. And that is what makes horror films terrific.